The narrative around the Boofkoof has officially shifted dramatically. This time last year, 3 separate rants of mine were banished to the deepest, most depraved tracts of the YouTube memory hole for merely opining on this subject. And if I were to so much as mention the dreaded coof word, there's an 11 in 10 chance the Google Gestapo will still awkwardly and automatically append an obnoxious exhortation for us all to study the facts in detail, often with an accompanying link to a government-mandated website filled with information they now concede was outright false. And this authoritarian cohabitation of private business and state-sanctioned narrative is still something the socialistic left laughingly refer to as the free market. What a decuman difference a year makes. The Pope of the Pinko Pox, Anthony Fauci, has spent much of this past fall admitting fault while awkwardly evading culpability, and what he's since conceded was a mishandling of the response to the bat death. While Menshevik mouthpiece The Atlantic published an op-ed just a week ago that insisted, as if it hadn't been loudly suggested by the previous president and his supporters for over a year, that lengthy school closures were a failed policy, and as if they hadn't called him a dangerous fascist for so much as proposing it. And it's also The Atlantic that made more waves than Boogie's waterbed this week when they suggested, unironically, that we declare a mutual pandemic amnesty. Quote, "We need to forgive one another for what we did and said when we were all in the dark about COVID." On the face of it, the eternal optimist might take this to mean that we wipe the injuries on either end of the ledger clean and move forward wiser and as one. In practice, what emerges is an unremitting tempest of sophistry and rationalization, inexpertly camouflaged as conciliatory claptrap. Are there affronts on both sides? Sure, the laws of probability being what they are, I'll just go ahead and assume that there are. But only one side of the societal schism passed mandates to disemploy any and all who refused to comply with edicts they now admit were functionally useless. Only one side shuttered California's entire beachfront for interminable months, rounding up and arresting all who violated the spurious directive. Only one side persecuted congregations for convening regular church services, sometimes under penalty of imprisonment, while taking cringeworthy care to craft a public statement via the CDC, abjuring the self-same directives for racial rioters, effectively underwriting the Summer of Love festivities that killed 19 people in just 14 days, or as it's known in Chicago, a slow weekend. Only one side prescribed remote funerals. Only one side barred relatives from attending the death of a beloved grandparent, spouse, or even child, and it was only one side that refused to even entertain the suggestion that the Wuhan lab leak was responsible for the pandemic, despite credible health officials strongly suggesting otherwise, nearly all of whom were penalized by having their social media accounts forcibly closed. And it's only one side who now quietly acknowledged the truth of the lab leak theory in Congress just this past month, with only conservative news outlets even bothering to report that fact. You weren't in the dark. You were wearing blinders, and you had anyone who attempted to remove them deplatformed or arrested. Quit lying. And yes, I'm aware these are not perfectly unique observations, but first off, this is YouTube. You're subscribed to 100 channels that offer nothing but observations that are not unique. Why piss on me? And second, the purpose of this video isn't to offer some manner of earth-shattering inside or existential treatise. It's not to marshal an army or helm a social movement. My reason for making this video is simple: to remind you of what they did. I think it's fair to say, in a world where we went from Obama opposes gay marriage in 2008 to government-funded penis removal surgeries for the underaged in 2018, that the only detachment surgery we truly need is to separate the term fallacy from slippery slope. Never mind that slippery slope sounds like the name of an Asian Dick Tracy villain. For said incline to be politically effective, it must first be lubricated. And the authoritarian opposition cannot accomplish that because they aren't in a position to. Only entrenched a-holes on our own side can facilitate that particular feat. 100 years of accepting the false premises of our enemies by arguing on their own terms should long have disabused you of that fallacious notion. It wasn't the brilliance of socialist economists or bra-burning feminists that turned universities into struggle session study hall. It was right and libertarian-leaning economists who were so busy arguing the inefficiencies and impracticalities of socialism that they unwittingly and implicitly accepted the underlying unspeakable evil that seizing the property of strangers is morally permissible if it's done in service to some nebulous collectivist social principle. Milton Friedman and Murray Rothbard, whatever their other virtues, did more harm to liberty and property rights by arguing on and thus accepting the flawed moral premises of their enemies than the most frothing, fidel-filating socialismo in all of academia. Hell, the lockdowns, mandates, and assorted-ass hannery would have been impossible if implemented only by the opposition. It was Trump himself who initiated same, albeit with a fair amount of buyer's remorse within weeks of enacting it. And if Trump intends to run for a second and final term in 2024, it's a lesson he must demonstrate he's learned, or I, for one, will happily pull the lever for Paul, DeSantis, or a grilled cheese sandwich before I allow a well-meaning moron to grace the despotic slip and slide so the true tyrants can inherit and exploit it, as Biden inarguably has. Because if we don't, then just as before, when we move on, when we forget, when false premise piles upon false premise, then the very fabric of reality is permitted to be indicted not by objective fact or observable reality, but by narrative as misportrayed by mainstream media. Which brings us to why we're here, seated beside the smoldering rubble of the post-Koof-pocalypse, where 1,000 false narratives congealed into one incendiary uber-falsehood that enabled our entire political and media class to attack, arrest, or otherwise unperson anyone at all who dared be instructed by their own eyes, ears, and discernment. And now the trust the science crowd are feeling a little less trusting of the science, now that Fauci and the Funky Bunch are adding more asterisks than Barry Bonds' stat sheet, and you suddenly want to bury the hatchet? Oh, sweet cherubic summer child. We won't be forgetting, and we're well beyond forgiveness. We won't forget losing gainful employment at the altar of authoritarian mandates we warned you about passing. We won't forget beloved local businesses being bulldozed by alarmist collectivism. We won't forget bidding farewell to the ones we love over the intimacy of Skype. We won't forget funerals convened behind a plastic divider, if we were allowed to attend at all, only for Gammy to be fired into the earth in a pneumatic fucking tube like a paycheck at a drive-through bank teller. We will not allow you to recast it as Trump's lockdowns when you demanded he do worse, and did once your shambling shitheel was installed into office. Trump shoulders his share of the blame for a fact, but his culpability in the status monstrosity we're presently enduring is a teardrop on the face of the fucking ocean next to what you've allowed to occur. We do not accept your apology. We are not talking terms. My response is as pithy and permissive as the one you shot at us over the preceding 2 years. Get fucked and go to jail, though not necessarily in that order. I'm Razor Fist. Don't forget, don't forgive, and God fucking speed.